If we're going to host our own zones, then we're going to need the PowerDNS package installed. We can also make use of a MySQL or other type of database as the backend, so we don't have to rely on a flat file. To begin with, we're going to make sure that we've removed the recursor. We can use these two together should we want, but we're generally going to pick up our requests from the recursor and then have a forwarding record for the zones that we host. For the moment, though, we've already seen that we've removed the recursor, and we're going to leave it that way. We can then install our database backend, so we're installing the client and the server. We need the database in place because during the installation we can then create the database on the database server. So whilst we're installing the PDNS server and the PDNS backend MySQL, it will then go through and run a config for us. This way we don't have to worry about creating the database and the database objects such as the tables ourselves. As part of the configuration, we have a PDNS simple bind configuration, and this isn't used, but it will actually clash with one of the settings that we need, so we remove this file. You can remove it or you can move it to another directory should you feel you don't want to remove it. But we won't be using it, so we're happy to remove it. And then of course we can restart the service. So these are the high-level steps. Let's look in a little bit more detail by moving on to our server. So we're back on the command line of the 1404 machine. You see I've gained root privileges. When we go through and use our apt get install -y, and we're going to put on then the MySQL-client and the MySQL-server. We're going to need these installed before we install PowerDNS. This is going to be our back end, and then during the installation of PowerDNS we can have the system configure the database for us. So we have the configuration of the MySQL server during the installation. So let's set the password for the MySQL root user. So with that done, let's just clear the screen. We can go back up and we want to now continue our installation. So we're going to put in then the PDNS-server, and we're going to use then the PDNS-backend and MySQL because we want it to integrate with our MySQL backend. Now we can then go through and create our configuration. So we can do this manually ourselves and then create the configuration. However, this does make a good idea just to let the system run through. So we're going to say yes, configure the database. And we of course need to put in our root user's password so that it's able then to create an account for itself and the required databases. We're going to set then a password for the MySQL application user that it's creating. So it's going to be creating a user called PDNS for MySQL. And of course we're going to set a password. We're going to make sure that's different to our normal MySQL root account. Now we can see a little bit of what's happening. If I move through into the etc/init.d directory, this is where our service is going to be. And if we then go through and look at then pndns, and then we'll just stop the service. If we want to see what's happening with the service, if we use monitor rather than start, we're able then to bring it through to the foreground so we can see what's happening with our service. And we can see that we're getting an error come out trying to set the unexisting parameter gmysql host. Well, the problem is with this, we mentioned it in the slide, but we have a configuration that duplicates this. So we need to remove this configuration so that it uses just the MySQL configuration. So I'm going to move through and take a look into the etc PowerDNS directory, and then just go into pdns.d. And when we look in here, we've got the gmysql.conf, and that's what we want to use, but we've also got this simple bind.conf. As we added in the backend and configured the backend for MySQL, it created that configuration, but it's got its original configuration we need to remove. So we're going to remove pdns and then simple bind.conf. With that done, if we move back into the initd directory and go back from here and pdns and then stop and go back to our monitor, we can see now that we've got our system up and running. So let's just Control-C out of this so we can get back to our command line, and let's go through and restart our service. So of course we want to be running normally, not in the foreground. So the system will be up and running now, and we should be able to see this with our good friend netstat. So if we go through for our listening TCP ports, and we'll also show the process, we can see then that we're listening on port 53 from the pdns_server. So our system is up and running, or at least to a degree. Let's just take a look at this a little bit more. If we go through and use the dig command, and if we just look from the local host, so we see we're getting a response from the server, but we didn't ask a question, so obviously we're not getting an answer as such back. If we try and do a request where we're not hosting the information, obviously we're not hosting any information at the moment, so we just have a short response, so we only get to see the answer, and we look for something, well again we'll keep it quite short, www.forward.com. And we can see we're getting absolutely nothing back because recursion is turned off by default, and PowerDNS do expect us to be running separate servers, one to do the recursion and one to host zones. So it really doesn't fit into their mentality. However, should we want to have both running on the same server, we can enable it through the configuration. So if I go into etc PowerDNS and look in then the pdns.conf, and if we search for the keyword recursor, so / and recursor, you can see me typing towards the bottom of the screen, and we can then see our result coming up, but it's commented out. So if we go to the recursor equals line, and then we can then just specify where we want recursions to happen. So which system is going to do our recursion for us. So remember, we don't do recursion on this system. So we can then put our recursor to 8.8.8.8. With that then saved, we can go back and restart our service. So I'm just using pdns once I get my spelling a little bit more correct, and restart. And now we should be able to repeat the dig command and be able to get a response coming back from the servers. So we're able now to pass our recursion onto the Google DNS servers, so we don't have to carry out the recursion on this host. But hopefully this has given you a little bit of an idea of how we can set up a PowerDNS server with MySQL. Let's return to the slides now so we can finish up this section.